The Great Hall of Nexus Station stretched for nearly 2 kilometers, and every species in the Galactic Concord had sent representatives to witness what they considered a formality of little importance. Ambassador Elena Vasquez walked through the massive doors with her head held high, though she could feel the weight of 1,000 alien eyes upon her and her small delegation. The Torvax delegation clicked their mandibles in what humans had learned to recognize as amusement, and their leader, a towering insectoid warrior named Crixtel, leaned toward his aide and made no effort to whisper. "Look at them," Crixtel said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "So small and fragile, like the prey insects we fed to our young back on the homeworld?" Elena pretended not to hear. But her aide, a young man named David Chun, clenched his fists at his sides. The Selenari floated past in their crystalline forms, their bodies catching the light and scattering it into rainbows across the floor. And one of them paused near Elena to scan her with telepathic senses before recoiling, mentally deaf. The Selenari announced to its companions, like trying to read thoughts from a stone. And yet they believe they deserve a voice in galactic affairs. The administrative quality processed the human documents with their many tentacles moving in patterns of obvious boredom, stamping forms and filing reports, without even looking at the humans who had traveled so far to submit them. Elena had prepared for this treatment because Earth's intelligence services had warned her about what to expect, and she used every moment of condescension as an opportunity to observe and learn. She noticed how the Torvax warriors moved with confidence born from centuries of conquest. But she also noticed how they relied entirely on strength and intimidation rather than strategy or cunning. She watched the Selenari communicate through telepathic networks that connected their entire species. But she also saw how this connection made them vulnerable, because what affected one could affect all. She observed the rigid hierarchies and ancient protocols that governed every interaction in the Concord. And she understood that these beings had grown comfortable in their power. They had forgotten what it meant to struggle against impossible odds. The ceremony to formalize Earth's protectorate status lasted 6 hours, and every minute was designed to remind humanity of its place at the bottom of galactic civilization. The Concord assigned humanity a development zone consisting of Earth and its immediate solar system, with strict limitations on military expansion and technological research. Human ships were required to register with Concord authorities before leaving their home system, and human colonies were forbidden without special permission that everyone knew would never be granted. Elena signed every document and accepted every restriction with grace, because she understood something that the arrogant species around her did not. Humanity had been underestimated before, and humanity had learned to use that underestimation as a weapon. 3 years passed, and Elena returned to Nexus Station many times to represent Earth's interests in minor disputes and trade negotiations that the Concord considered beneath their attention. She built relationships with junior officials and maintenance workers and transport crews, and she gathered information that her superiors back on Earth analyzed with great interest. Then the hegemony of Krath arrived from beyond the galactic rim, and everything changed. The Krath were unlike anything the Concord had faced in 4,000 years of galactic dominance, and their first attacks came without warning or declaration of war. They struck the outer colony of Terex 4 and left no survivors, and their ships moved in formations that made no sense according to traditional military doctrine. The Concord responded with confidence because they had crushed every threat to their power for millennia, and their admirals assembled the greatest fleet in living memory to meet the Krath in honorable battle, the Battle of the Crimson Nebula. Lasted 14 hours and ended with the destruction of 60% of the Concord fleet. The Krath did not fight with honor, and they did not respect the ancient conventions that govern warfare among civilized species. They use suicide ships and biological weapons and psychological attacks that broke the minds of telepathic species. And they showed no interest in negotiation or surrender within 6 months. The craft had burned through 8 Concord systems and were advancing toward the Galactic Core Nexus Station, became a refugee center as millions of displaced beings fled from conquered worlds. And the Great Hall that had once hosted ceremonies of arrogant power now sheltered the broken survivors of species that had thought themselves invincible. Elena walked through the refugee camps and saw Torvak's warriors who had lost everything. Their proud forms now huddled in corners, and their mandibles clicking in patterns of grief rather than mockery. She saw selenary crystals that had shattered from psychic trauma, their fragments scattered across the floor as their companions tried desperately to piece them back together. She saw Queldi, administrators who had kept perfect records of their entire civilization now clutching data tablets that contained the only remaining copies of their people's history. Crystal, the Torvak's leader who had mocked humanity so openly, now sat alone in a corner with his compound eyes staring at nothing. His homeworld had fallen 3 weeks ago, and his entire bloodline had been exterminated in the assault. Elena approached him slowly, and he looked up at her with eyes that had seen horrors beyond imagination. "Your species must evacuate to the protected reserve worlds," he said in a voice that had lost all its former arrogance. "The Concord cannot guarantee your safety if you remain here." Elena sat down beside him, and for a long moment she said nothing. "We are not leaving," she finally replied. Crystal made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. "Then you are fools," he said. "The craft cannot be stopped, and your tiny species with your fragile bodies and your short lives will be crushed like insects." Elena looked at him with eyes that held no fear and no judgment, only a quiet determination that Crystal had never seen in any species. "You called us weak," she said, "and you were right that we are small and fragile and short-lived. But you made a mistake that powerful beings always make." She stood and looked down at the broken warrior, who had once towered over her with such contempt. "You confused weakness with helplessness," she said, "and you forgot that the weak have been fighting against the strong since the beginning of time. And sometimes the weak win." She walked away, and Crystal watched her go with something new stirring in his heart. It was not hope exactly, because hope had died with his world, but it was curiosity about what these strange little creatures might do next, far away on Earth. The United Council was already meeting in emergency session, and the words that would change galactic history were about to be spoken. The United Earth Council chamber had never been so quiet, and the weight of what was being discussed pressed down on every person in the room like a physical force. General Marcus Chum stood at the podium with his hands clasped behind his back, and his weathered face showed the calm confidence of a man who had spent 40 years preparing for a moment that everyone else thought would never come. "The Concord has ordered us to evacuate to the reserve worlds," he said, and his voice carried clearly to every corner of the chamber. "They expect us to hide while they fight a war they are losing." Councilwoman Sarah Okonkwo leaned forward in her seat, her dark eyes sharp with intelligence and concern. "And what exactly are you proposing instead?" "General," she asked. Marcus touched the control on the podium, and the holographic display behind him came to life with images that made several council members gasp in surprise. Ships filled the display, hundreds of them, and they looked nothing like the clumsy transport vessels that the Concord had approved for human use. These were warships, sleek and deadly, with weapon systems that combined technologies from a dozen different species in configurations that had never been attempted before for 30 years. "The Concord has dismissed us as primitives," Marcus said, "and for 30 years, We have let them believe exactly that while we watched and learned and built." He gestured to the ships rotating slowly in the display. "The Concorde gave us access to their technology because they thought we were too stupid to understand it. And they were wrong." Councilman Jiang Wei, the eldest member of the council, stroked his white beard thoughtfully. "You are suggesting that we deceived our galactic benefactors," he said, and his tone was carefully neutral. "I am suggesting that we survived," Marcus replied, "which is what humans have always done when faced with those who would dismiss us or destroy us." He changed the display to show tactical analyses and intelligence, reports that human agents had been gathering for decades. "The Concorde fights with honor and tradition because they have never needed to do otherwise. And the Krath are exploiting that weakness with brutal efficiency." The images showed Concorde fleet formations that had not changed in 4,000 years. Predictable patterns that the Krath had learned to counter with devastating effect. But humans remember what it means to fight dirty. Marcus continued, "We remember what it means to be the underdog. And we remember that survival matters more than glory." The council debated for 3 hours, and voices rose and fell as different members argued for caution or action or some middle path that satisfied no one. In the end, the vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. Operation Prometheus was authorized deep in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. Facilities that the Concorde believed were mining operations and research stations began to reveal their true purpose. Massive doors opened in the sides of hollowed-out asteroids, and ships that had been built in secret for decades began their launch sequences. Commander Yuki Tanaka stood on the bridge of the flagship Defiance and watched her fleet assemble through the main view screen. She was 43 years old, which meant she had perhaps another 50 years of life ahead of her if she was lucky. And she had chosen to spend whatever time she had left fighting for her species. Her crew was young and determined and terrified, which was exactly how a human crew should be when facing impossible odds. "Commander," her tactical officer reported, "the fleet is assembled and awaiting your orders." Yuki looked at the 200 ships that made up the first human fleet, and she knew that by Concorde standards, this was a pathetically small force. The Torvax had sent 10,000 ships to their deaths at the Battle of the Crimson Nebula, and the Selenari had sacrificed twice that number trying to hold their crystal homeworld. 200 human ships against an enemy that had crushed fleets 100 times larger seemed like madness. But Yuki also knew something that the Concorde and the Krath did not. Humans had never won their wars through superior numbers or overwhelming force, and they had always found ways to make their enemies regret underestimating them. She activated the fleet-wide communication channel, and her voice reached every ship in the formation. "I know what you are thinking," she said. "You are thinking that we are too few and too weak and too outmatched to make any difference in this war." She paused and let her words sink in. "The Concorde thinks the same thing, and so do the Krath, and that is exactly why we are going to win." Her crew looked at her with eyes that wanted desperately to believe, and she gave them what they needed. Humanity has always been small and weak compared to the forces that tried to destroy us. And we are still here because our ancestors refused to accept that weakness meant defeat. She thought of every war in human history where the famed smaller force had triumphed through cunning and determination and sheer refusal to surrender. "The Krath have never fought an enemy like us," she continued. "They have fought proud warriors who stood in formation and died with honor. And they have fought telepathic beings who broke under psychic assault." Her voice hardened with conviction. "But they have never fought a species that learned to win by being underestimated. And they have never faced an enemy that turns weakness into a weapon." She looked at her bridge crew one final time before giving the order that would change everything. "They think we are weak, and we are going to show them what we can do when it refuses to die quietly. The first human fleet engaged its engines and began its journey toward Krath-occupied space on Nexus Station. Concord observers monitored the human departure with bemused curiosity. 200 ships, a Torvax military analyst noted with something almost like pity. They will be destroyed within hours of engaging the enemy. A Selenari observer scanned the tactical data and made a dismissive gesture with its crystalline appendages. The humans are committing species suicide, it said. We should prepare rescue operations to recover any survivors, though there will likely be few. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood in the observation deck and watched the tiny dots of human ships disappear into the darkness of space. A Queldi administrator approached her with a document that required her signature. Some bureaucratic formality related to the expected casualties. I am sorry for your loss, the Queldi said in a tone that suggested it was not sorry at all. Perhaps this will teach your species to know its place. Elena signed the document without looking at it, and she kept her eyes fixed on the stars where her people were heading toward what everyone believed would be certain death. Perhaps, she said quietly, and a small smile crossed her face that the Queldi did not understand. She knew something that the Concord had not yet learned. Humans did not go quietly into the dark, and they certainly did not die according to anyone else's expectations far away. Commander Tanaka reviewed her battle plans one final time and prepared to introduce the galaxy to a new kind of warfare. The Krath Forward Command Base on Velo 7 was considered the most heavily defended position in the occupied territories, and 40,000 warships orbited the conquered Torvax colony world informations that had crushed every Concord attempt to retake it. Admiral Zethkar of the Krath hegemony stood on his command bridge and surveyed his domain with dissatisfaction of a predator that had never known defeat. 3 separate Concord counterattacks had broken against his defenses, and each failure had only strengthened his reputation among the Krath High Command. His sensor officers monitored the surrounding space with practiced efficiency, watching for any sign of another futile Concord assault. Admiral, one of his officers reported, we are detecting a small fleet of unknown configuration entering the sector. Zethkar turned his attention to the sensor display and studied the approaching vessels with mild curiosity. How many ships? He asked. 200. Admiral Zethkar made a sound that in his species passed for laughter. 200 ships against 40,000, he said. The Concord must be desperate indeed to send such a pitiful force. He watched the approaching fleet for several minutes, waiting for them to form up for the traditional assault formation that the Concord always used. Instead, the human fleet did something that made no sense at all. They scattered. 200 ships split into 40 groups of 5 and began dispersing in seemingly random directions across 3 different sectors. Zethkar stared at the tactical display with confusion. What are they doing? He demanded. His tactical officer studied the dispersal pattern and could find no logic in it. Unknown, Admiral, the officer admitted. Perhaps they are fleeing in panic. Zethkar considered this explanation and found it satisfying. Cowards, he declared. They saw our strength and their courage failed them. As it should. He turned away from the display and returned his attention to more important matters. For 6 days, nothing happened. The 40 human squadrons moved through Krath-controlled space without engaging any targets. And Concord observers grew increasingly convinced that the humans had simply lost their nerve on Nexus Station. A Selenari admiral drafted a report condemning human cowardice and recommending that the species be permanently barred from military participation in galactic affairs. In the refugee camps, Torvax survivors who had briefly hoped that someone might stand against the Krath returned to their despair. But Commander Yuki Tanaka was not a coward. And she was not running away. She was hunting her 40 squadrons had spent 6 days mapping every craft position in 3 sectors, identifying every supply depot and communication, relay and fuel refinery that kept the massive craft war machine functioning. Human ships were small and their sensor signatures were weak, and the craft had dismissed them so completely that they did not bother to track the scattered vessels moving through their territory on the 7th day. At a moment precisely coordinated across 3 sectors of space, humanity struck. 40 squadrons hit 40 different targets simultaneously, and the craft suddenly faced chaos on a scale they had never experienced. A fuel refinery that supplied 600 warships exploded in a cascade of fire that lit up the darkness of space. 3 communication relays that connected Admiral Zefkar to his subordinate commanders went silent at exactly the same moment. Transport ships carrying ammunition and replacement parts for the Velo 7 fleet found themselves under attack from enemies that appeared from nowhere and vanished before they could respond. Supply depots that had taken months to establish were destroyed in minutes by human ships that struck with surgical precision and withdrew before heavy reinforcements could arrive. Admiral Zethkar received reports of attacks across his entire command, and for the first time in his career, he felt something unfamiliar. He felt uncertainty. How is this possible? He demanded of his officers. 200 ships cannot attack 40 positions at once, but the evidence was undeniable. And his fleet at Velo 7 suddenly found itself blind and hungry and cut off from the supply lines it needed to function. Zefkar ordered his ships to pursue the attackers, but the humans were already gone, slipping away into the vastness of space before his massive warships could even lock onto their positions. For 18 hours, the craft scrambled to respond to attacks that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Their commanders sent desperate messages requesting reinforcements, but the communication network was so damaged that most messages never arrived. Their ships consumed fuel trying to chase enemies they could not catch, and their warriors grew frustrated at fighting an opponent that refused to stand and die with honor. Then, at hour 19, the final blow fell. A single human stealth ship called the Whisper had spent the entire battle slipping through the chaos toward the craft command vessel. Its captain, a woman named Maria Santos, had volunteered for a mission that everyone knew might be one way. But Maria was not carrying a bomb. She was carrying something far more dangerous. The Whisper approached close enough to upload a data package directly into the craft communication network. And within minutes, every ship in the sector received the same transmission. The package contained intelligence that human agents had been gathering for months, documenting corruption among craft commanders, evidence of resources hoarded while frontline troops starved, proof of secret deals between craft nobles and Concord, officials to sacrifice common soldiers for personal gain. It revealed that Admiral Zethkar had been promoted not through merit but through family connections, and that his tactical decisions had caused unnecessary casualties that he had blamed on subordinates. It showed that the glorious craft hegemony was rotting from within, and that the warriors who fought and died for its glory were being betrayed by the very leaders they served. The effect was immediate and devastating. Craft ships that had been hunting humans suddenly turned their weapons on each other as long simmering resentments exploded into open conflict. 3 subfleets mutinied against commanders they now knew had been lying to them, and Admiral Zethkar found himself fighting a civil war in the middle of what should have been his greatest stronghold. Commander Tanaka watched the chaos unfold from the bridge of the Defiance and allowed herself a small smile. "Recall all squadrons," she ordered. "Our work here is done." The first human fleet withdrew from craft space with minimal casualties, leaving behind an enemy that was destroying itself on Nexus Station. The sensor operators stared at their displays in disbelief as reports came in from across 3 sectors. The Selenari admiral, who had drafted the report on human cowardice, deleted it without a word, and across the galaxy, beings of 100 different species asked the same question. What had the humans done? And how had they done it? The answer would change everything. The emergency assembly of the Galactic Concord was the largest gathering of species representatives in 400 years, and every seat in the great chamber was filled with beings who had come to demand answers. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood at the central podium and faced thousands of alien eyes that looked at her with something she had never seen before. They looked at her with respect. The human fleet has returned from Krath-occupied space, the Selenari High Counselor announced, and reports indicate that they have accomplished what 3 Concord counterattacks could not. Murmurs rippled through the chamber as representatives whispered to each other in dozens of languages. Ambassador Vasquez, the counselor, continued, "The Concord demands an explanation of how your species achieved this result." Elena had prepared for this moment her entire career, and she took a breath before responding. "For 30 years, you have called us weak," she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the massive chamber. "And you were correct." She paused and let the confusion spread through the audience. "Humans are physically weaker than the Torvax, and we cannot match them in direct combat." Krickstow, watching from the Torvax delegation, leaned forward with interest. "Humans live shorter lives than the Queldi, and we cannot accumulate the knowledge and experience that their centuries provide." The Queldi representatives exchanged uncertain glances. "Humans are mentally deaf compared to the Selenari, and we cannot coordinate through telepathic networks or share thoughts across vast distances." The Selenari counselor's crystalline form flickered with colors that suggested surprise. "By every measure you use to judge a species, humanity is inferior," Elena continued, "and that is exactly why we won." She activated the holographic display and showed images from human history. Wars fought across millennia against enemies who should have been unstoppable. "Weakness is a teacher," she said, "and humanity has been learning from weakness since we first walked upright on our homeworld." The display showed ancient battles where outnumbered forces had triumphed through cunning and determination. When you are weak, you cannot afford to fight fairly, and you cannot afford to fight with honor that your enemy does not share. She showed the tactical analysis of the first strike. How 40 squadrons had identified vulnerabilities that Concord strategists had never considered. When you are weak, you learn to find the cracks in your enemy's armor, and you learn to strike where they least expect. The display showed the intelligence operation that had turned Krath ships against each other. When you are weak, you learn that your enemy's greatest weakness is often not their defenses, but their beliefs, and you learn to use their own assumptions against them. Elena turned off the display and faced the assembly directly. The Krath believed they were fighting another honorable enemy who would stand in formation and die according to tradition. And that belief cost them more than any weapon we could have fired. She looked at the Torvax delegation, at the warriors who had lost everything to an enemy they could not understand. "You forgot what it means to struggle," she said. "You became so powerful that you stopped learning. And when you faced an enemy who fought without rules, you had no idea how to respond." Her words hung in the air, and no one spoke to contradict her. "Humanity never had the luxury of forgetting," she continued, "because we were always surrounded by enemies who were stronger than us, and we survived only by being smarter and more adaptable than our circumstances should have allowed." The Selenari counselor's form shifted through several colors before settling on a shade that Elena had learned to associate with deep thought. "You are saying that your weakness was your advantage," the counselor said slowly. "I am saying that weakness taught us lessons that Strength made you forget, Elena replied. And those lessons are why we are standing here while your fleets are burning. A long silence followed. And then Crickstall rose from his seat and walked down the steps toward the podium. The Torvax general who had once mocked humanity as prey insects stood before Elena and looked at her with eyes that had seen his entire world. Destroyed, my people have lost everything, he said. Our homeworld is ashes, our warriors are scattered, and our pride has been ground into dust by an enemy we could not defeat. He paused, and Elena saw something in his posture that she had never expected to see from a Torvax. She saw humility. Will you teach us? Crickstall asked. Elena considered the being who had treated humanity with contempt from the first moment they met. And she thought about what kind of answer she should give. She thought about the millions of Torvax refugees who were suffering in camps across the galaxy. Innocent people who had nothing to do with their leader's arrogance. She thought about what it meant to be human, and what kind of species humanity wanted to be. Yes, she said, because that is what humans do. Crickstall's mandibles clicked in surprise. You would help us after how we treated you? He asked. Elena smiled, and it was not a smile of triumph or revenge. We help people who need it, she said, even the ones who did not help us, and especially the ones who thought they did not need our help. She looked around the chamber at the thousands of beings who were watching this moment. Humanity did not survive by holding grudges, and we did not win our wars by refusing to ally with former enemies. She extended her hand toward Crickstall in the human gesture of partnership. We survived by learning from everyone, including those who tried to destroy us, and we won by building coalitions that our enemies thought were impossible. Crickstall looked at her hand for a long moment, and then he reached out and clasped it in his massive grip. The chamber erupted in sounds of shock and amazement as beings witnessed something that had never happened before. A species that had been dismissed as inferior was offering to teach the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy how to survive within days. The second human fleet launched with Torvax volunteers integrated into every crew, and the war against the Krath entered a new phase. The galaxy was watching, and humanity was just getting started. 3 years had passed since the first strike, and the galaxy had been transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. The war against the Krath hegemony had been brutal and costly, and humanity had paid for every victory, with blood and lives that their short lifespans made even more precious. But they had not fought alone. Torvax warriors who had once dismissed humans as prey had learned to fight alongside them, adopting guerrilla tactics that turned their natural strength into something far more dangerous than brute force. They learned to strike from shadows and withdraw before the enemy could respond. And they discovered that patience and cunning could multiply their power in ways that charging headfirst into battle never could. Selenari telepaths had discovered that the mental deafness they once mocked in humans was actually an advantage against the Krath. Psychic attacks. Human soldiers could stand on the front lines and shield their crystalline allies from the mental assaults that had shattered so many of their kind. And in return, the Selenari provided coordination and intelligence that made human tactics even more effective. Even the bureaucratic quality had found a new purpose. Their obsessive record keeping transformed into intelligence analysis that identified patterns in Krath movements and vulnerabilities in enemy supply lines. Species that had never worked together learned to combine their strengths in ways that none of them could have achieved alone. Commander Yuki Tanaka, now Admiral Tanaka, led the coalition fleet that finally broke through to Krath Prime. She stood on the bridge of the Defiance and watched as ships from a dozen different species fought side by side in patterns that would have been unthinkable 3 years ago. The final battle was not the glorious confrontation that traditional Concord doctrine would have demanded. Instead, it was a coordinated assault that struck the Krath homeworld from 17 different directions simultaneously, targeting infrastructure and communication networks and leadership bunkers with the surgical precision that humanity had taught its allies, the Krath hegemony, which had conquered 12 Concord systems and seemed unstoppable just 3 years before. Collapsed in less than a week, their leaders surrendered not to overwhelming force, but to the realization that they could not fight an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere. An enemy that refused to stand still and die according to proper tradition when the war ended. The galaxy faced a question that no one had expected to ask. What role should humanity play in the new order that was emerging from the ashes of the old? Some species wanted humans to lead the reconstructed Concord, arguing that they had proven themselves superior strategists and that their victory entitled them to a position of power. Others feared that human ruthlessness and cunning would become tyranny if given galactic authority, and they warned that the same traits that had defeated the Krath could be turned against former allies. The debate raged across 1,000 worlds, and representatives gathered once again in the Great Hall of Nexus Station to decide the fate of humanity and the galaxy. General Marcus Chun, now old and scarred from years of war, stood at the podium where Ambassador Vasquez had once defended humanity against contempt. Now he stood to defend humanity against something more dangerous than mockery. He stood to defend humanity against the temptation of power. I have been asked to accept leadership of the new Galactic Coalition, he said, and his voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the chamber. I have been told that humanity has earned the right to rule, and that our victories prove we are superior to those who once looked down on us. He paused and looked around at the thousands of beings who were waiting for his answer. I refuse. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the assembly. Humanity did not fight this war to rule you, Marcus continued, and we did not sacrifice our sons and daughters so that we could become the next empire to oppress the galaxy. He brought up images from human history, not of victories but of failures. We fought because we understood something that our own history taught us through bitter experience. The display showed empires that had risen and fallen, conquerors who had become the conquered, powerful civilizations that had collapsed under the weight of their own arrogance. Every species that has claimed the right to rule has eventually fallen, Marcus said. And they have fallen because power made them forget the lessons that brought them to power in the first place. He looked at the Torvax delegation, at Krixtel, who had become one of humanity's closest allies. We did not defeat the Krath by being the strongest, he said. We defeated them by being adaptable and by learning from everyone around us. He looked at the Selenari, whose crystalline forms glittered in the chamber's light. If we become rulers, we will stop learning, and we will become exactly what we fought against. He turned off the display and faced the assembly with the calm certainty of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Instead of leadership, humanity proposes something different. He outlined a plan that had been developed over months of careful thought, a vision of what humanity could offer the galaxy without claiming dominion over it. On Earth, we will establish an academy where any species can learn the art of adaptive warfare, where the lessons of weakness can be taught to those who have only known strength. He described training programs that would teach guerrilla tactics and intelligence, operations and the psychological insights that had turned the war. We will teach you how to find hope in desperate odds, how to turn disadvantage into opportunity, and how to win against enemies who should be unstoppable. He looked around the chamber one final time. Those lessons are not human lessons, he said. They are universal truths that any species can learn. And we simply happened to learn them first, because we had no choice. The vote was not close. The Galactic Coalition was formed with humanity. as teachers rather than rulers. And the Academy of Adaptive Warfare opened its doors on Earth within a year. Students came from every corner of the galaxy. Young beings from species that had once dismissed humanity as primitive. And they learned from instructors who had once been told they were too weak to matter. Admiral Tanaka retired from military service and became the first director of the academy. And she spent her remaining years teaching the next generation of warriors how to fight like humans. Ambassador Vasquez became the voice of humanity in the new coalition. And she worked tirelessly to ensure that the galaxy never forgot the lessons that the war had taught. And across the stars, a new saying emerged among species who had learned what it meant to be underestimated. It was spoken by Torvax warriors who had learned to strike from shadows, and by Selenari strategists who had learned to think without telepathy, and by quality analysts who had learned that numbers could be weapons. It was spoken by young cadets arriving at the academy for the first time, and by old veterans who remembered when humanity was nothing more than a joke. The saying was simple, but it carried the weight of everything the galaxy had learned. Never underestimate a human, because they have been underestimated before, and they know exactly what to do with it on Earth. The sun rose over a world that had once been isolated and afraid, and children looked up at the stars and dreamed of the adventures that awaited them. They were still small and fragile and short-lived by galactic standards, and they would never be the strongest or the fastest or the most powerful beings in the universe. But they were human, and that was enough. It had always been enough. The galaxy had simply needed to learn that lesson the hard way.